We've got so much art history and never enough time to cover it all. So let's go run through the art museum. Before we get into Unit 4, I just want to talk about how this Unit 4 is structured. As you know, the class is divided up into 4 different, sections to be graded. Your exams are worth 40%. The beast is worth 20%. Your activities, which are going to be, you're doing your tableau vivant and your grand manner portraits. You're doing those, right? And your lecture notes and quizzes are worth 20%. So the exams, there are 4 units. The first unit, I dropped the weight of the exam to 10% because everybody's still getting used to the class. All right. And then the unit 2 and 3, those are 30%. And unit 4 is also 30%. But it's such a big unit, I divided that up into 3 mini tests. So the first part of the Unit 4, we'll be discussing modern art before World War I. There are 5 different styles that I'm going to talk about. And with that exam, I've made the exam to be 25 questions instead of 40. I'm going to give you 10 artworks to memorize instead of 20. I'll test you on 2 of them. And we'll have 1 unknown. The second part of Unit 4 will be modern art between the wars, between World War I and World War II. And then the test is done the same way. That has 8 styles of art that I'm going to discuss. And then, it's a lot, Then we'll take that test. The test is structured the same way as the first one. And then when that's done, we will look at modern art after World War II. And there's 5 styles that I'm going to look at.
Would a multiple choice be 1 point each? Or would it be different? It's not the regular test like
You are right. Yes, that I had not considered that yet. I've made the test. I will make it all worth 100 points. Each one of those will be worth 100 points. Each test will be worth 100 points. All right. I'll figure it out. I'll find a way to figure it out. All right. Does everybody understand kind of the structure for Unit 4? All right. Any other questions about this? That was a very good question. All right. So at the top of your next empty page, I want you to write Chapter 29, Modern Art. In Chapter 29, there's lots of different styles. Just as a reminder that I want you to write this page number in your table of contents. So look at this page number, go to your table of contents, write this for modern art. And then also this is a reminder for 5 sketches per chapter. That's not necessarily per style of art because there's lots of them, but 9 per chapter. By the way, chapter 29 covers from 1900 up to World War II. So that's 13 styles of art that we're going to be looking at. All right. Now, those of you that have had me both semesters, and for those of you that are new, as we get into the 20th century, we're going to see a lot of styles of art come and go. And they're very fast moving and they're very short. So I wanted to remind you of how throughout the history of the world that we've been looking at, how the styles of art keep getting faster and faster. For example, we started out this year in ancient Egypt, and that lasted almost 6,000 years, roughly. Ancient Greece lasted about 900 years. Ancient Rome lasted about 900 years. Byzantine lasted about 900 years. The Gothic era lasted about 350 years. And then we get to the Renaissance this semester, and that lasted about 150 years. Baroque lasted about 150 years. Rococo was a very short-lived movement, but it lasted 50 years. And Neoclassicism, 50 years. Romanticism, 50 years. Realism is now down to 30 years. Impressionism is down to 30 years. And post-impressionism down to 20 years. Do you see a pattern? It gets shorter as time goes on. So, the pace of innovation gets quicker and quicker. Some of these movements that we're going to be looking at last only a couple of years, but they're very important as they are impressed. The other artists and other art styles are influenced by them. So that's why we study them. Before we get to any of the artwork, let me just talk about what's going on at the turn of the century, the year 1900. So before New Year's of 1900, there was a lot of fear that the end of the world was coming. People felt kind of the same way about Y2K. Yes, I remember Y2K. And my biggest fear of Y2K wasn't that the world was going to end, but I kind of worried about, the computer. They are all talking about the computers not being able to figure out if it's 1900 or 2000, and that would make all the computers crash. And then, yeah, but it turned out the computers were smarter than we thought. So after the celebrations and the world did not end, there lots of people had hope for the future. In general, there were new freedoms in many places on earth. People were living longer and healthier than ever before. People were proud of the achievements and confident of the future. And we had a peaceful stability for a while. There was no war in Europe since 1870, and people wanted that peace to continue. There was a Great Paris Exposition in 1900. That's kind of like a state fair, but they're showing like all the new inventions and the new technology is on display. And the exposition symbolized the hopes of the people. There were 50 million visitors that attended the Paris Exposition in 1900. People believed that nations could compete peacefully and avoid war. They also believed that education and science would improve our lives. Also, at this time, we had all this new technology. Technological advances at the turn of the century made our lives better, and they added to the hope that people felt for the future. From the late 1800s to the 1900s, the telephone was invented, the record player was invented, electricity was harnessed. They invented film. We talked about photography. X-rays, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, X-rays allowed doctors to look inside the body and see what was wrong instead of cutting people open or guessing. Radio waves allowed for transmissions to go across without a wire. Automobiles and airplanes were invented. So people were excited for the possibilities with the new technology. And as we get into this 20th century, we can see how at the very beginning of the 20th century, or even just before, we have like the telegraph and the first transatlantic telegraph cable, all the way to like 1988 is where the invention of the internet. So yeah, it's crazy how much technology improved and advanced in one century. I did talk about colonialism quite a bit for the 19th century lectures, and it's still a big deal in the early 20th century. This map shows you what parts of the world are under which European countries. So, for example, over here, I'm going to get my laser pointer. Over here, there's all these flags. So, for example, England right here, everything that is associated with England is this peachy color. So Australia, India, all these parts of Africa, Canada, that at the beginning of the 20th century, that was all under English rule. And so I've told you before that the sun never set on the English Empire. One of the reasons to have all of these colonies is to get the resources so that you can build in your factories. Africa is still a big deal in the early 20th century. Check this out. In 1870, only 10% of Africa was under formal European control. By 1914, 90%. So within 40 years, it goes from 10% being under European control to 90%. That's a big deal. Africa is full of resources: diamonds, gold, rubber, palm oil, ivory, cocoa, tea, tin. And rubber is the most important resource at this time because with rubber, you make hoses that are needed in factories, seals, shock absorbers for machinery. But the invention that's changed the world is the automobile, and you need rubber for the tires. So there's a huge plunder of Africa for its resources. In fact, I want you to know the Berlin Conference of 1884. This was put together by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, and he convened a council of all countries of Europe to discuss the division of the African territories. The whole purpose of this was to prevent European countries from going to war over African territorial disputes. This was called the Scramble for Africa. Basically, all the leaders of Europe sat in a room, and it was basically, all right, I'll take this part of Africa, you can have that part of Africa, and him over there, he'll take this part of Africa. And I find that shocking because nobody in Africa was consulted, with one exception. Ethiopia, the king of Ethiopia, wrote a letter to the conference of 1884 and said, we don't want to be a part of that. And Ethiopia is the only, in fact, if you look at this map, it's the only one here in gray. It was the only one left alone. But if you look at this map right here, and it's all color-coded, it lines up with these European governments right here. Belgium controls the Belgian Congo, or Italy is in charge of over here for Somalia, and so on. Also at this time, we have a new interest in archaeology. This is a time of active archaeology. European powers are using their access to colonies to plunder the cultural heritage of those places. The most prominent archaeologists at this time are Europeans and Americans. The cultural objects are removed from dig sites and sent back to Europe, and they're often using shady tactics to trick or steal objects and send them back home. The justification for this is that these objects, they're too fragile to leave them here. They need to be looked after in a museum setting. That's where they'll be safe. So they didn't see this as stealing these objects. They saw them as rescuing these objects. So to give you an example of the shady schemes of getting these cultural objects out of Africa, in the area where this was found, France was in control of what comes in or out. And the French were doing a pretty good job of keeping African objects in Africa. And this was found by some German archaeologists. So they had to sneak it past the French government to get it out of Africa. So to make it look unimportant, they covered this in dirt, and they took some low quality photographs of this, and then they wadded up the photos and kind of folded them up so that the photos didn't look valuable. And then for the description of this, they wrote unremarkable, right, on the paperwork. And so that fooled the French inspectors, and they were able to get this out of Africa and into the museum. So those are the kind of shady practices that archaeologists use to plunder Africa. So not only is all this stuff going to museums in Europe, but also the objects that are not of great value are going to curiosity shops and ethnological museums. So this is a museum for Africa in Belgium. And here we have a curiosity shop. So at a curiosity shop, people can buy objects that are coming back from Africa. So archaeologists and colonizers are bringing back curious objects and trading with the locals and missionaries too. So somebody, can just is walking by, sees some interesting things in a window, and comes in and may buy something, or just kind of, look around. And this like same with Japan. These Japanese objects, these African objects, were very different to the Europeans at this time. All right, I want you to pay close attention to that term, primitive art. In the early 20th century, Africans were seen as a primitive culture, and so therefore the art that they made was called primitive. So this is art of Africa and Oceania. So the one on the far right, that would have been something that would have been found near Australia or Hawaii. So it's not just Africa, but it's mostly Africa because Africa is so close to Europe. So this art was seen as more honest and direct. If you think about it, the artists that are being trained in Europe are being trained by the academy. They're being trained what to paint and how to paint. and it's not as honest. These artists that are being trained by the academy, their creativity is a little bit stifled because they have to paint a certain way in order to get their artwork in the salon. So here's something totally new and fresh. And if artists start working this way, they're totally free of the academy. It's more natural than art produced by artists trained in the traditional method of Europe and Western art. This art might seem uncomfortable from a Western perspective, but it is a fact that this primitive aesthetic had a very strong impact on the early modern art. So here are some African masks put next to faces in modern art, and you can see that these modern artists are looking directly at African masks as an influence of their art. And here we have a photograph of a young Picasso in his studio, and you can see in the background he has bought some things from the Curiosity Shop. I really want to stress hard that African art is a huge influence on modern art, just like Japanese art was a huge influence on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. All right, I want you to know the term avant-garde. What language does avant-garde sound like?
French.
It's French, yes.
Oui.
It's French for the front guard. And that's a military term. You think about your army going up and attacking the army that it's ahead of it, or it's in front of it. And the guys in the front are going to meet the enemy first. They're the leaders. They're the ones that are taking the biggest risk, but they're the ones that are going to have the greatest glory. So now we translated that military term into the art world. And this term avant-garde kind of comes about, during the Impressionism, Post-Impressionism time period. But we can apply this idea to all throughout art history. For example, if we compare the late medieval artwork to the early Renaissance, in this situation, the late medieval is the old tradition. That's the old style of art. What's new and different is the early Renaissance. They're the ones being bold and groundbreaking. But then after a while, the early Renaissance becomes what's old. And then what's new is the high Renaissance. They're being bold and different and putting forth new ideas. And so, this continues on. For every new art movement, the avant-garde is the one that's new and doing innovative work. So let's skip all the way to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Impressionism becomes the old tradition, and the Post-Impressionism is doing things beyond. It's doing things ahead of the Post-Impressionists. And then now that Post-Impressionism is now old, what's the new, right? What's next? What's next after Post-Impressionism? Yeah, let's go, right? So we're going to go over to Europe, and then we're going to look at Fauvism. Fauvism is the avant-garde that replaces Post-Impressionism.